I'm Fatheree,
This is Dave.
and this is Tex-Trek.
Engage.
Welcome back aboard the Starship Texas for the 142nd installment of the Tex-Trek podcast, the home for Star Trek fandom from deep in the heart of Texas, where we have deep talks about Star Trek. We have deep talks about Deep Space Nine. And right now, me and Dave are watching season 3 of Deep Space Nine, and we wanted to talk about these 2 episodes, past tense parts 1 and 2, a very strangely relevant story to today.
Sadly relevant would also be an acceptable descriptor.
Actually set in the 2020s, the decade we currently live in and enjoy or enjoy the best that we can. We have a special guest, though, a returning guest, Will Nguyen, the Star Trek communist, recently featured on StarTrek.com, is here to join us. Will, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. I'm glad I was invited back to be on this fine show to discuss a very fine episode. It's only age better with time. Unfortunately, age better with time. Yes, if you haven't read that article on StarTrek.com, you should check us out. I got a lot of positive feedback, but also a lot of negative feedback. But hey, at least we're talking about it, and that's the whole point about doing stuff about Star Trek is to talk about it.
Yeah, well, I know that when we have you on, we're only greeted by very, very positive feedback. Everyone loves seeing you. I don't hear any negative stuff.
If they do, I'll step on their throat.
Yes. Oh, you're far too kind, you guys. I did not pay them to say that, so I really appreciate that.
Hey, we've got a pretty cool audience, is what Fatheree is saying.
Yeah, I drove all the haters away long ago, or trimming the fat, as I called it. But this episode, these episodes, this story does mean a lot to us right now here in Austin, Texas, where we recently voted to basically start rounding up all of the homeless people. Austin gets a lot of credit as being like, oh, it's the big liberal city in Texas. But unfortunately, that does not always, mean good things for the people who live here. We have a very pro-business attitude, part of the larger neoliberal conservative politics of being in a red state like Texas. And
they don't like the eyesore of homelessness.
Yeah, we have the richest man in the world, Elon Musk, moving here, and there's this big tech bro startup mentality here, and we actually see that in this episode. We see a San Francisco of the 2020s that seems to cater more to the tech bro Britter and his equals, and not so much for the poor people out on the streets struggling from the sad reality of the 21st century. So just Dave, I think we should just kind of recap this episode just kind of briefly, but basically Sisko, Bashir, and Dax, through a transporter accident, are sent back in time to the year 2024, where they are found on the sidewalk, passed out. They are taken to a sanctuary district that is used to house all of the homeless, just to keep them out of sight. And it's actually pretty terrible. A lot of them have mental illnesses. A lot of them were just struggling to find work, and their jobs were lost due to automation or whatever factor. And when they try to show it to the rest of the world, show the true ugliness of the reality, they have the Bell riots. They have the big riot incident, and then the cops come and shoot a bunch of people. And history is restored, though, and Sisko and Bashir and Dax beam back to the Defiant in the 24th century.
Yeah, not quite as easy as it sounds in summation, but yeah, that's the raw events of it. The interesting thing is that Sisko is extremely aware of the events that are about to occur, and of the importance of a particular man named Gabriel Bell, and ultimately finds himself sort of having to stand in that role. And so there's all sorts of interesting internal dynamics and lots of class discussion, especially also as far as how Dax ends up in a very different place than them. But yeah, that's the gist of it.
Things
and
worked out a little better for her. The blue-eyed white girl. Things worked out a little better for her than the black and brown dude. You know, there was a lot of people walking by on the sidewalk who could have seen Sisko and Bashir, but no one like volunteered to help them. I noticed watching this.
Well, what's interesting is like they don't call attention to it in the episode. Sisko never says, you know, that's funny that you ended up there and we ended up here. But it's, I'm pretty clearly intentional. Will, do we want to so this is my first time seeing this. I know that y'all have probably watched it multiple times. I'm sure Fatheree has, maybe you two will. Do we want to do just kind of some general thoughts on the episode real quick? Or
yeah, Will, what's your take on past tense parts 1 and 2?
Well, I just want to say first off, I think it's great the fact that Dave is watching this for the first time, because it's always fun doing rewatches with people that have not watched it for the first time, because they pick up actually stuff that, you know, you didn't pick up because maybe you watched it at a different time in your life. Because I watched it first, I can't remember the first time I first watched it. It was probably years ago, before, you know, my worldview developed, my politics, who I am as a person developed. So I watched it in a completely different mind space. Only on subsequent rewatches that I really fully appreciate it. So I think you're watching it now in, you know, 2021, it has a resonance, considering that 2024, the ostensible start of this episode, is just a couple years away, right? So, you know, that's wild, right? To think that really does alter the perspective of this, much like other movies. Watching it again now, it's a completely different ballgame. Blade Runner is a great example. It's in 2019 Los Angeles. That's already passed, right? It's now officially in our past, right? But when we first watched it, it was this, you know, near future or distant future. So I think this episode, I think, is it's a great showcase for Deep Space Nine. Kind of is, in my opinion, my personal favorite of the Star Trek series. Although I like all of them,
oh, wow.
I think because it can do this two-parter really well. It balances everything very precisely. There's a lot of techno babble. There's a lot of Star Trekness of how they even got there, and the whole B story of Kira and O'Brien, all those type of stuff. You know, the Star Trek premise to even get there, right? But they all play it straight, right? The fact that they are in this, you know, universe, they're actually in some pretty world-changing events. And that's the thing so great about this episode, is that they play it pretty straight, and they understand the significance of it. They don't shy away from it. But at the same time, you know, I think, you know, it's sadly more prescient now. I think the Deep Space Nine documentary, when you do finish the series, Dave, I think it's well worth watching. What We Left Behind, it's a fantastic documentary. They focus a lot on this episode, talking about how, you know, when they made it, they didn't know it was going to be so foreshadowing events. They didn't want it to be so foreshadowing of these events. They say that, you know, it's very much, not much has changed. There's some other episodes later on that you'll see that also has the same kind of themes too. But I think at the same time, the fact that it described situations so effectively, but the fact that it also hasn't changed very much since when it was first debuted, which I think was 1994 to now, I think shows you kind of the limitations of liberalism, the limitations of, you know, this episode, as good as it is, doesn't actually name the system that's causing it, which is capitalism, right? At the end of the day, it's still a very liberal answer. They just say, as long as people need to know, and if people know what's happening in the sanctuary districts, they'll change, right? And it's an appeal to a higher authority. It's an appeal to the conscience of the oppressors, as if only they knew, then they would be forced to act out of guilt. And unfortunately, we know nowadays that's not true. You know, we have social media in a way that was not evidenced in that episode. People know all sorts of suffering and misery, and yet nothing changes, nothing happens. So I think that shows you the limitations of this episode, where it presupposes that you can appeal to the conscience of your oppressor, whereas I'm a socialist, I'm a Marxist, I know that that's not true. It really requires a revolutionary change. But that doesn't take away from anything in this episode. I think that's why it's only gotten better, because it just accurately describes what's going on right now, almost unintentionally. But that's the power of kind of a fiction, that sometimes you can kind of accidentally tell a fantastic story that ages better with time.
Yeah, and it is something that I think about watching this, is that our reality is in a few ways like kind of worse than things turned out here. A part of that being true with like, yeah, if we could just like, show what's going on. Oh, look, like they're watching it on the internet in China, and like everything's going to get better now. And sadly, that is not the case. Although there is a certain power in like using social media, or the net as they have it here, to kind of spread information. It can kind of help in some instances. Like I think recently with the George Floyd killing that kicked off a bunch of anti-police movements across the world. I think a big part of that was people actually seeing the footage of a police officer so carelessly murdering a dude while people are screaming, "Please stop! You're murdering that dude!" And so I think there is like sometimes a power in that, but unfortunately, it doesn't always spark the change that we need it to. And some of the things that they talk about in this episode, like at some point there was a federal employment act, so that sounds like there is at some point like a job guarantee. And at the beginning, the cops ask them for, do you have your UHC card, which I'm guessing was like a universal healthcare. So they were actually thinking 2020 would be way better off for the United States than it actually is. So yeah, that is kind of depressing to think about.
Father, are you talking about the sort of the whether we can sort of guilt people into awareness, into action? And I think part of the thing that they had not foreseen with the net was the when every voice is given equal time, it's also easy to counter program against certain messaging, and propaganda is out there, and there's a sense of like inundation that does sort of speak to something that Bashir, who gets some really interesting role in this one, that's kind of takes him out of his somewhat comedic places that he's sometimes in, but a recognition of like like sort of how did this happen, and I think a little bit of the modern thing that they hadn't quite seen yet at the time was like information overload, and maybe just a sort of, I don't know, empathy overload or something like that. That's it's interesting, but it's also it's also an adventure on the order of like City on the Edge of Forever. And what struck me a little bit as the difference between the two is that City on the Edge of Forever kind of has as its heart a sort of a love story, and also a sort of a classic time travel conundrum. Doing a good thing triggers a butterfly effect of something terrible. And when they travel back on Deep Space Nine, they engage more. Oh, and Kirk was in the Depression, but to them it was just a thing that they were passing through. It was just almost more of a stage through which that they were trying to find someone in. They have to engage more directly with it in Deep Space Nine, and I thought that was interesting. It's like they are a part of the Depression essentially in this episode, and so that was both exciting and difficult to see. It's hard to see your heroes kind of laid low like that, as Bashir and Sisko are.
Yeah, Kirk and Spock just had to work in a soup kitchen for a little bit. They were never really in like any like grave danger.
Right. And even arguably, Bashir and Sisko only have to endure it a few days. But in these sort of metaphorical way that Trek can speak to something, you see the effects on them. You see them sleeping in alleyways, and you see them kind of get a little bit broken in that time, and it sort of at least hints at the longer term effects.
Will, let me ask you about some of the things that pop up in this episode, which may or may not have been intentional, but there actually are like some little criticisms of capitalism in here. I think, in particularly, what stood out to me was the cruelty of the system was largely based on, you know, people just like doing their job, just following orders. We meet the nice lady who worked in the office. She said, yeah, I tried to like help a woman one time. It almost cost me my job. We have the Dick Miller, that's the name of the actor, right? From
Everybody knows this guy from
Yeah.
Joe Dante movies where he always plays the crusty curmudgeon.
He needs the overtime. The guy Bernardo, he's got a wife and kid at home he's supporting, and so they engage in this cruel system because they're just trying to make ends meet. You know, that's a big part of reality. Were there any other, you know, things like that that we can use to kind of like analyze or criticize capitalism in this story?
Well, yeah. So I think absolutely. So even though, you know, they don't mention it by name, I think absolutely you can totally use a Marxist analysis of this episode, which is why I think I've have talked about this episode before. You know, we've had movie nights where we've had this watch party where we watch this episode, we do a little chat, and we've done. Other people have talked about this episode as being very pivotal in that way because it lends itself so easily, so readily to that analysis because it's true. And how do you make sense of this type of stuff? And I think the way you make sense of it is that's exactly how a system perpetuates itself until it can no longer perpetuate itself, right? In the sense that it perpetuates itself on the acquiescence of the working class that it oppresses, because the working class actually is far outnumbers the ruling class, far outnumbers the ones that actually exploit people, right? But it can only exist in that, it can only continue to exist as an oppressive system because of the acquiescence of the working class, because they're beaten down, because they're put in check by the armed bodies of men, which Len talked about in State and Revolution. The armed bodies of men, you see it right here in this story, exactly right. Those two enforcers, right, that guard the sanctuary districts, right there. They're very much those average Joe, you know, Joe lunch bucket type. You know, he just wants to go home with his wife. Doesn't want to work late. The other guy needs to do overtime, right? You know, really gets into that kind of proletarian nature of this type of work. Although they play a very unique role of keeping kind of the lumpen proletariat, which is those that are dispossessed from having any types of jobs, which is those in those sanctuary districts. They're promised jobs, they don't get jobs, right? So they're just kind of in there. And that woman, right, that social worker who just kind of, in a lot of ways, was kind of explaining the situation in an info dump type way, saying this is what this is what you know, a dim is, and that kind of stuff, right? And a gimme, like all those types of stuff. I think shows you that the system can only run when the people are broken down, they're cynical, they're just jaded, which is very true. Speaks a lot to our current situation right now until there's a moment of which there is an upsurge. And we don't know when that upsurge is going to come. But that upsurge comes when we don't know what particular sets it off, but it's almost like the straw that breaks camel's back, where, you know, it's just so intolerable, right? They've already lived, they've already gone through so much shit. This is the one thing where they just can't take it anymore, right? And of course, in this episode, it's Gabriel Bell, right? That would be the one that galvanizing person, kind of that accidental in the sense that they're in the right place at the right time. In order to galvanize something that's already been brewing underneath the surface. Of course, Sisko and Bashir come in, kind of inadvertently, you know, do that, you know, time travel paradox type of situation, which is so kind of wonderfully cliche and tropey, but it's so very Star Trek. Right? How many episodes of Star Trek do this type of stuff, and they do it really well. It's their calling card. It's what they do, right? And I think this is one of the better episodes that does that type of aspect, right? But I think that can show you there is some optimism there too, in the sense that things are not static, in the sense that opinions can change based off of the changes in material conditions, based off the environment. So at the end, you know, that Dick Miller character, he's the one that started to say, you know what, I may need to re-examine some of my own views, my own prejudices, that kind of stuff, right? You know, it's possible to see that happen in real life. And in fact, we've seen it happen in real life. That's actually what the ruling class is very afraid of, when they start to lose control of their armed bodies of men, which is actually why this past summer with the George Floyd protests, there was strong resistance to send in the military and the National Guard, because there was a fear amongst the higher echelons of the U.S. ruling class that if they did that and used it against these protesters, they weren't sure they could actually control the military. In the same way that happened during the Vietnam War, you had them elements of the military refusing their orders, They were fragging their own officers, disobeying them because you know what? Hell no, we won't go, right? And there was a situation where, these military folks, if they were ordered to shoot on protesters, would they do it, right? And there's a footage that went viral last year of I think a National Guardsman or just an Army enlisted person, right? They zoomed in on his face, and he was black, and you can kind of see him like crying. There's a tear, and he's wavering because he could hear the protests and the chants from the people. This is in Washington D.C. actually, so this is like right near the White House, and you kind of see him vacillating, right? That vacillation is exactly what the ruling class does not want to do, which is why they're like, do not send the military, and that's why they broke with Trump, because they knew they did that, they could lose control of the situation, because that's the only thing holding them back. Holding back the masses from their true power is, this armed bodies of men. But it shows you in these particular moments, it can happen, and it does happen, and it will happen as the continuing crisis of capitalism goes on. And people can see, which side are you really on? Who are you really protecting, right? Well, you should be on this side with us, and you're on the wrong side of the barricades. And that's, I think, that's the thing that's actually gives me optimism and hope, because I know that that's the thing that will happen. Right? People can kind of see that, wait a minute, am I actually on the right side here, right? And that's when a mass movement really becomes a revolutionary one, when it takes on that character, and the ruling class begins to lose its ability to control the situation. That's why I just said, hey, go home. We'll give you the demands we want. That's actually how reforms are won, and when there's a threat of that. But I think in this episode, Bell Riots, they kind of go there. They kind of knock on that door. They don't quite get there, but they do say, like, this is something that could potentially spiral out of control. You need to kind of nip it in the bud. Yeah, those are my kind of initial thoughts.
It's got more edge than the average Trek, as I've learned that Deep Space Nine is commonly does, and they tend to push harder at like maybe some of the more difficult questions. So here you've got something that I don't think they would have lensed on the on TOS, where Sisko is taking part in sort of, I know partly to preserve history, but he's taking part in an armed insurrection, holding hostages, trying to keep them alive, but participating. Who's the guy with the hat?
BC.
BC, right.
Big Earl Flynn fan for some reason.
Oh, that's right. Yes, maybe that was supposed to show why he had a little bit of a flair for the theatrical there. But yeah, that's not something we would expect to necessarily see of a captain on Star Trek getting involved in that. At the end, when Dick Miller kind of wavers and he's clearly reconsidering position, on a certain level, it felt like a little bit of that sort of slightly Pollyanna, slightly forced ending. But this is something that we've seen in real life too, which is that it has to become a personal experience sometimes for people. I think especially on the right, especially from conservative backgrounds, to sometimes sort of to feel it, that certain social injustices, until it affects them, it's hard for them to empathize or wrap their head around. And in that sense, it did feel real, even if it's a 2 hours of TV kind of condensed ideas in there. But I don't know. How'd you feel about it, Fatheree?
Yeah, that's interesting. Like, hearing y'all talk about it kind of makes me like that character's arc more, because I kind of want him to like still get shot at the end. Like, I'm still like so mad at him, and I'm just kind of like all cops are bastards enough that like I don't want to see any of them redeemed. But no, like, the story does have more meaning if you do show him go through that realization. And that, like Will said, that is the optimism of the
You could argue
story.
that at the age he is in that, his 50s or whatever he is, that it's a lesson he should have been able to learn perhaps before having to go through this. And so I think it's fair to be mad at him. He's an asshole. His partner seems to be the sort of more sympathetic one. His, younger and not as jaded and set in his ways. It's clear that Dick Miller's guy has gone a long time, shuffling through this and has made his peace with the way things work a long time ago. I guess this episode might speak to the need for a revolutionary shock for opinions to change.
I think it asks that question. It doesn't answer it. It answers it in a way that it needs to resolve the episode, right? So,
sure,
the episode needs to end. They need to get Sisko, Bashir, Dax back into the future. They need to restore the timeline, and they say that this is how it happens, right? So this kind of shocking event is able to somehow spur the governor of California and other politicians to start enacting major reforms. And that, Sisko kind of narrates at the end saying, this is the beginning. They begin to turn things around, right? And this was actually a few years, maybe a couple years before First Contact, right? When we realized, like Vulcans arriving, meeting humans for the first time, that was the real galvanizing event, right? So they were kind of laying a little bit of an early foundation to say, at some point, when does it start changing to become like that better world that we know Earth will be in the 23rd or 24th centuries and what have you? They kind of lay it down here, but then they just, that's it, right? They say, okay, we need to remember the lessons, we need to never forget those types of things, and they move on. And I think on the one hand, I get it because it's an episode they kind of have to end and get back to basically square one, right? How do you get back there? But at the same time, has some very, very huge assumptions that they're making. That, quite frankly, as a Marxist, as a communist, is very naive to say that that these politicians will be shocked into giving up their power willingly, like that the rich guy that Jadzia hangs out with.
Yeah. Brenner, I think was his name.
Yeah, Brenner. Yeah, they just need to. He just needs to give them access. He's this benevolent rich guy with heart of gold, and they're alluded to he kind of used to be a radical,
right?
He used to be kind of edgy. He had that Maury tattoo, but he covered up. He sold out, which is, I feel, kind of dates the episode. It's a very Gen X type anxiety at that time, right? Like, oh, you sold out, man. Like, I used to be a rocker back in the day, and now like I work in like before the .com burst, right? Tech company, like the early ones, right? Like, oh, I sold out, man. Like that type of stuff, right? Which shows you kind of like this was made in the mid 90s, right? That's what that mindset was, right? So this Gen X rich dude, right? Like an early proto Bill Gates, right? Like, okay, I can, if you appeal to his conscience, we can kind of get things going. And that is a very liberal interpretation of how events happen, right? It's all individualistic. Good and evil are very just they're two halves of an individual. You need to balance it out. You need to appeal to your conscience, right? As opposed to a real material question of who controls power, who controls the means of production, who controls the levers of society, and you do not ask or you not petition people to give you what you should already be granted, right? And I think that's the conceit of Star Trek. And unfortunately, that's what it is. It is what it is. I'm actually not as harsh as I'm sounding, but it's still a tremendous jumping off point to talk about these things. But only a socialist revolution, in my opinion, can resolve the questions of the Bell riots and the sanctuary districts of which we're having right now. Right? We have all this information, we have the ability to do it. Clearly, nothing's happening, nothing's changing. So clearly, this episode doesn't really provide that answer. So what is the way forward? Is just electing better Democratic politicians to tear gas us, but they're more diverse now. They're, I mean, that's the answer, right? That's the answer to say. And I think people deep down know that's not true. And I think that's why, again, I mentioned, you got to watch Deep Space Nine documentary when you can, because they kind of talk about this episode and they're kind of like, they kind of say, not much has changed between now and then, man. We got to, and they kind of get into a real world politics a little bit at that time. And it's a somber moment of the documentary. But again, the documentary doesn't really pose a question. What do you do? Like, what is to be done? Right? We know things are bad. Okay, great. So what do we do about it? And I think that's the conceit out of all of these episodes. These well-meaning liberals, right? How to address these social ills is not through charity. It's not through voting for better oppressors, right? It's really a question of revolution. But oftentimes liberals say, you know what, revolution is just as bad. It's just as bad as the thing you're fighting. You see it in Marvel movies all the time, right? The villain has a point until they do something cartoonishly villainous to make sure that audience doesn't sympathize too much with the villain or whatever, because all these problems are imminently solvable, but they're not solvable within that universe because it can't be, because you won't have a universe really. So I think the question really is like, it's always an issue of like, you can't go too far, right? You can't go too far, otherwise you become like the bad guy. It's a very common trope.
Yeah, I'm so tired of stories like that. Like, Will, do you watch The Expanse?
I do. I haven't watched the last season, but I've heard it goes in that direction.
Yeah, it's a well-made show. It's incredibly well produced, well acted. The effects are amazing. It looks great. Really, really great scenes and moments. But the overall takeaway of the show, I think it's just like you got to be the extreme moderate to win. You can't you can't go too far with anything, and it gets old after a while.
We talked about this, Father. That very much was the ethos of the comics in the era that I grew up in, the Bronze Age. I weren't most of the writers were kind of classically liberal minded, and they definitely had a, hey, we don't want to become the villains ourselves was kind of always an idea. And Trek has they were influenced by Trek too, like TOS, and so you can read that all over those comics. And but I will say there was a lot of shotguns racked in this episode for for nonviolent pushback. They definitely, if only symbolically, spoke to I'm going to say a more aggressive revolution.
Yeah, it had a little bit of you can't wage revolution in white gloves to it, I guess.
Right. Well, I'm trying to remember what was the guy's name? BC Hatman. What prompted his initial takeover of that office? Is there a spurring event?
I think he was just bored and wanted to be where the action was. He wanted out of there, right? He wanted out of there. He wanted a little bit of money and a flight out.
He was going to get a flight to South America or
Tasmania.
Tasmania,
that's where Earl Flynn was born.
Right. Okay, so he was kind of a chaotic spark to the fire, and it sounded like the humanity of Gabriel Bell was kind of what won people over, as well as we see in the sort of testimonials of the average people who are in there.
Although it's strange how quickly they forgive BC for being the dude who stabbed the real Gabriel Bell to death.
That's true. I think that's very much a TV trope thing where they kind of have to tie that off, right? Because you're right. If this was done in the modern day, it would not just be 2 episodes. It would probably be like a whole season, right? Or or at least 5 episodes or what have you, right? But the fact that it was given 2 parts is enough. It was more than quote unquote more than enough for the 90s, right? That was a special extra long episode, but you really have to wrap it up after 90 minutes. And I think again to this episode, I think I get what you were saying about you. This does seem very aggressive, and it does seem
for Trek. It is,
and I think that's what gives it its appeal and its longevity. And the way it's acted, the way Avery Brooks talks about these issues, the way Alexander Stig talks about these things, and it's done really, really well. Again, I think the thing that's missing, I think I love this episode. I may sound overly harsh than I actually am, but I think the thing that's missing in this episode is part of the conceit that goes into it. Is where does the power of the working class come from? Does it come from when they seize weapons and they hold hostages? That's one way to interpret things. Is it one way when they make demands because of that? Is one way to hold power? As a Marxist, I would say actually that's actually not correct. Actually, when they take up arms, it should be the last thing you do. It's as a defensive posture to defend yourself if necessary. But you do everything else in order to avoid that, because the greatest strength of the working class is actually their proximity, and their relationship to the means of production, right? So, of course, in this episode, you don't see them talking about spreading this outside of the sanctuary districts to say, you know what, you want to change the conditions here in San Francisco, then we appeal to the workers outside of the sanctuary districts, get them to participate, get them to stop production, get them to go on a general strike, right? Get them to join in solidarity. That's what was missing in remember what happened last summer for a very brief time with Jazz, the autonomous zone in Seattle at that time, right? What was missing in that particular aspect was them recognizing that they wanted this thing to succeed. It needed to actually link up with the larger working class of the city of Seattle, of the state of Washington, elsewhere, right? To say, you know what, you really want this thing to actually go beyond, Occupy 2.0. It actually has to go beyond just the people within that particular area. You have to, have a class message to say, we're all the same class. You want to have maximum solidarity. The best way to do that is to not divide based off of race, of nationality, of sex, gender, and what have you, sexual orientation, what have you, right? Is to say that we're all being oppressed, not just those in the sanctuary district, but those outside of them. We're all being oppressed. Who's oppressing us? Who's the one that's calling the shots, right? They shouldn't be in power. We should, right? And that requires giving it a name, right? But of course, that doesn't happen in this episode, right? It's actually quite limited when they say they just want to have like jobs and they just want to have like a restoration of this particular act, as opposed to, we should be the one, workers' control of society, right? And I don't blame that because the writers aren't Marxists. They don't get that. They're not infusing that in that episode. But I think that's what's missing there, is because I think it presupposes that the only way the workers can get what they want is either asking nicely or taking hostages, of which taking hostages in the past is pretty counterproductive, arguably, because it actually doesn't gain the ear of the larger working class. It can actually alienate people, right? It can just make you into just these ultra adventurists. But the flip side of it also isn't to, again, appeal to people's emotions, or on some level, the whole episode or the whole scene where they just have those testimonials saying, hey, I'm a family man, I work hard, I just want a job, that kind of stuff. It does play into those model minority tropes, right? So you see that playing out at the border with the migrant crisis, right? The ones that are granted asylum are the good workers. They work hard. They can speak English. They want to assimilate. They want to wave the American flag. Blah blah blah. We'll let those immigrants in, right? We like to take out the bad immigrants, the ones that commit crimes and deal drugs and that kind of stuff, right? And those things just really just serve to break and divide working class solidarity. Say, you're more deserving because of this. And again, it plays into that to say, we just want to work. We're family people, that kind of stuff, right? And I don't. Again, I'm sounding a lot really harsh in this episode, but I'm really not, because I think regardless of that, it still asks really good questions. And that's the whole point of Star Trek, is to get you to talk about things on a larger basis. The fact that we're still talking about this episode, 20 plus years later, just shows you, it's really good as that tool.
You said it plays a key role in the documentary, which is a retrospective of the whole series. And if it's given that kind of time in it, then yeah, clearly, like, people think of it, identify it as key to the series.
It's that episode and Far Beyond the Stars, which you'll see later on, is another pivotal episode that they focus at least that middle section of the documentary on.
Yeah, which is kind of a time travel episode in its own way. So I just want to point out that Star Trek does time travel incredibly well. I hear a lot of people say like, "Oh, I'm tired of time travel in Star Trek." I'm like, all of the best episodes are time traveling, City on the Edge of Forever, Yesterday's Enterprise. Like,
but
they do it really good.
Fatheree, I know we've talked about this before, and I'm a person who thinks less is more, and I'll acknowledge some amazing time travel episodes. But let me ask, do you think that they should pursue more than they are doing because they're good at it? Or do you think that it should remain like this is what I think, is that they're good at it, and it should be sort of a special thing when they do it?
I mean, they're still doing it, because I don't want to talk about like leaked information on any of the new shows and development, but unfortunately, like, some stuff has leaked that I kind of like didn't want to know about, and there's going to be some time travel in some new Star Trek very soon. That's all I'm going to say. So
whether we want it or not.
Yeah, but no, I'm looking forward to it because it's something that I enjoy regularly when they do it.
Just don't make it Doctor Who is all.
Will, just to give you opportunity, because you said you don't want to sound too harsh on this episode. Let me just ask you, just what are some of the things as a DS9 fan that you really liked in this one?
So I love the B story of this because the B story is the most classically Star Trek, right? They're like somehow these chronotons, right? They the way they warped into the system, into the Earth, because they're going back to Earth for a meeting with Starfleet Command. Somehow, put them back in time, but the chronoton particles somehow shielded them from changes in the timeline, right? It's actually very proto First Contact in some ways, but and somehow they can't, it's lost in discussing the other aspects of the episode involving Bell, of course. But they talk about like all of a sudden they can't find any contact with other Starfleet ships. Like where they do, there's a whole scene where they're literally beaming into different periods of times, like the 20s, and they go to the 60s, and like that there's that moment where they meet the hippies, and they see them beaming up, but like like, oh, they'll clearly just hand wave that way, saying they're not going to believe those two people saying people just beamed away because they're too high on psychedelic drugs or something, right? It's a very classic trope of Star Trek to do those types of things. Giving Kira that bandage on her nose, just like Spock had the bandana in Voyage Home, like all those types of stuff, and they play it straight, right? O'Brien does his best to explain this thing, like how is this thing possible, just to justify, right? They'd have to justify Sisko, Bashir, and Dax being in that time period, right? So they have to come up with a whole B story, which in reality is pretty ludicrous, but they play it straight. Kira plays it straight, and it's done really well. And of course, at the end, they restore everything. But there's not a lot of those scenes. But I think the fact that it's there, them beaming down in those, and they're basically just trial and erroring it as they go, which is wow. They're just beaming into different periods of time and saying, "Are you here? Are you there? Are you here?" And they play it in a way it's kind of amusing. But imagine if that was actually happening in real life, that you had a limited amount of energy to kind of basically send you back in time, which is fantastical to think about. And you have to get it right. Like how, and it's based off of his calculations. Right? Brian's like, yeah, I calculated it's probably around this, right? Like imagine the pressure you have to do to come up with like, yeah, I think I'm going to send you to this time period. They may be here, they may not be here. And that's it, right? I mean, and the whole state of the Federation is riding on it because clearly, history has been changed, right? Like it's so like fantastical. The stakes are so high, and yet it's so ho hum to them. They're just like, yeah, it happens. What are you gonna do, right? Like that's the Star Trek. That's the best part about Star Trek is that these fantastical things that they encounter for us, for the most part, is just like another day at the workplace for them, right? Which is like, yeah, okay, time travel, it happens, right? Write it up in the book, right, or something, right? So I think that's why it's so balanced really well. They play it straight across.
Well, I see the T-shirt you're wearing, the Kira Che shirt. I have that shirt as well. Let me ask you this, because I think there actually is some cool stuff with that B story here that kind of ties into Kira's backstory as the anti-imperialist freedom fighter. When O'Brien says, well, there's 10 possible time periods they're in, but we can only try 5. She's pretty like gung-ho of like, well, I guess we have to try. Like to her, someone who fought like this oppressive, more advanced, more powerful imperialistic opponent, like, oh yeah, those are pretty good odds for me. I'm used to doing.
Oh, that's a good point. I didn't think about that. That's a really good angle. Really good point.
Yeah, Dave, what do you think of the B story stuff as someone watching it for the first time?
I have to confess, I thought it was a little too lightweight as things were heating up in the second part. It's like it was fun, but for me it was just like almost a little too goofy. Even City on the Edge of Forever had its comedic moments, and they were good at it. But I wasn't super engaged with it, to be honest. I think sometimes when they get to do like a deep dive on a place with like period costumes and stuff like that, it's enthralling enough that I was kind of like, yeah, get back to the A plot. And I don't know if we've ever talked about it on the show, but one of my favorite sci-fi movies is Soylent Green, which if I don't know if everybody knows the punchline of the movie, but I would recommend the movie as a kind of a dark and fascinating noir story as well, and that speaks to the overpopulation anxieties and a lot of the same sort of class warfare stuff that this episode does, and it has a similar sort of kind of washed out people sleeping everywhere in the streets vibe to it. So I was getting good vibes off of the proximity to a sci-fi movie I really liked, and again I kind of wanted them to return to it whenever they would cut away. But part of it's just it's kind of cool to see the regulars in sort of period piece clothes. It's sort of it's got an evocative quality to it. You know it feels more grounded. Suddenly you can kind of relate to them more. They feel a little bit more like they're stepping into our world. And a lot of Trek time hopping is to either sometimes far flung past or by the time I was watching TOS, the 60s was a bygone era. This is the closest the only time I've ever seen Trek that feels like they have time traveled to my era, and that feels like it's was more than just a pop exercise.
You didn't feel that in Star Trek 4?
What's that?
The Star Trek 4?
You know what? That's true, but that was also a bit of a pop exercise.
Okay, yeah, that's fair.
And there was the Voyager one I've seen too with Sarah Silverman, but that was pretty poppy as well.
You also didn't see it in the 90s, right? You watched it.
That's later. True. That's true. I was not there to imagine. Oh, I could have run into Sarah Silverman too. But yeah,
Future's End is not as good as Past Tense. No. Sorry to say, Voyager fan.
But you know what Voyager episode is really good is Timeless, another time travel episode. It's like the best episode of Voyager.
It's interesting. Yeah, there's one of the things that time travel episodes do is they lens the stakes of an era. It causes you to reflect on like the whole of history and the tides of history in ways that like a singular episode, like even if they're visiting a planet, and it's an analog or an allegory for something that we experience, it's still an alien and metaphor. And when we see Earth's past, especially, I think it can't help but have a resonance for us, and I think that's one of the reasons that time travel episodes tend to maybe bring out some of the best in the writers and make them think the hardest, because you're going to.
And you can also use it to tell very personal stories, like we saw in Yesteryear, the best episode of the animated series, and also a time travel story.
For sure.
Dave, I know that you had some opinions on Sisko and especially Bashir in this episode, and they're kind of the characters that get like the most spotlight, and like Sisko's 21st century history knowledge, and Bashir kind of being like the noob who doesn't know much about it, and he's experiencing this for the first time, kind of.
I always kind of sometimes read the notes, not every episode I see, but I was skimming the notes on Memory Alpha afterwards, and they mentioned that who's the actor who plays Bashir?
Alexander Siddig.
Yeah, that he found it a turning point for how they lensed the character, and I can certainly see why they, Bashir is not as if he hasn't had serious episodes and moments before, but there was a certain part of him that his character, I think, that was a little bit like a little shticky, that he was the spoiled rich guy for whom adventure was like a fun weekend. And when you drop him into something that's kind of inescapable and that has the sort of the weight that the episode did, it feels like it changed him, like almost like a, without them drawing attention to it, like a natural evolution of the character, that it was, he saw some stuff and he had to live some stuff, and that it would bring out this more serious side of him. So I really liked seeing that. I feel like his acting was kind of more nuanced and a little less of the sort of heightened shticky stuff that they would sometimes give to him. He's a good pair with Sisko. A lot of characters in Deep Space Nine, you pair them off in interesting ways. Odo and Kira, Miles and Bashir, and you get interesting dynamics happen. And obviously, Bashir was there somewhat as a sounding board for Sisko to do exposition too on a purely technical level. But yeah, I liked watching these guys together, and I felt like it was a really strong evolution for Bashir.
Will, what do you think of the Sisko Bashir duo in this episode?
Yeah, no, I think it was done really well. I just want to say, Dave, buckle up because you're going to see Bashir going to go through even more development, which is good things. All the characters go through development in Deep Space Nine, so Bashir is no exception. I think it'll be interesting rides. I am jealous you get to watch it again. I mean, not again. You have to watch it for the first time because I think it's always fun watching them for the first time. So there's a lot more growth, a lot more story, more to come on that.
I was honestly worried about Bashir early on in the series because he had a lot of like kind of sexist scenes is the only way I can describe it. Kind of attempts at sort of coercive dating stuff with Dax and, it's kind of quasi incel-y moments. So I was worried about it. And even in 3 seasons, I've been pleased to see that there's been growth and those kind of scenes have been dying down already. So
absolutely.
I'm ready. If they continue that, I'm ready, man.
It will only get better. I'll leave it at that. But I think it's going to be a cumulative effect across the board for a bunch of characters. As for I think my own opinion of that, I think of course it's very coincidental that sometimes one character is an expert in something 20th century. So Voyager, Tom Paris, I love classic muscle cars from the 1950s, right? That's just his one character trait, right? Or like Will Riker loves jazz, but only up to like the 40s, right? Like of the 20th century, right? It is very coincidental, right? But I think I think Sisko is another character that you'll see actually later on as the series goes on. He does have a very particular knowledge of Earth history, and I think actually relates really well as his character develops. So I think this is a beginning to foreshadow, like, oh yeah, Sisko kind of knows about early 20th or kind of mid 21st century history. Like that's interesting. Why is that? And I like the fact that someone like a Bashir, who we know is very smart, graduating near the top of his class at the academy, isn't an expert on this because it's several hundred years ago. It's several centuries ago. Right? Just like for us, like not all of us can be expert on medieval history or something happened in the 1700s, right? But there might be someone who is, right? And I like the fact that what they're not knowledgeable about is something that should be very second nature to us because we're living in it right now, or at least it was in the future at the time, right? 2024, right? It's similar to how certain things I think you've already covered it in Deep Space Nine up to this point, but baseball isn't a big thing anymore, right? Have you reached an episode where that's a thing?
Yeah, we saw that in season 1 with if wishes were horses when
Pokai, right?
Yeah,
right.
Okay.
Who would have been playing? Yeah, he would have been playing baseball. I guess like at this point in real life, the London Kings, which is not an actual Major League Baseball team, but I guess in the Star Trek universe it is.
So I like the fact that that's a thing that's happened, that somehow baseball no longer exists. We don't know really why. It just is, and it's kind of a fun wrinkle that's in there. And again, this is also brought up in the Deep Space Nine documentary, but just like the fact that something that we take for granted does change. Why should it change by the 24th century? Why should it be the same, right? So same thing here with history, right? There might be certain things that he's an incredible medical doctor, but he doesn't know about early 21st century history. Why should he, right? So then Sisko says, oh, I have a particular interest in that. Here's why. And it's convenient, yes, but I think it's interesting to kind of to say that history does change. Things are not static. That will be picked up later on again with Sisko in a different episode where he has a very particular knowledge about Earth history, which I think is neat because it shows you that, not everyone's going to know everything. Things will change. Just like they don't drink alcohol. Apparently, they don't drink real alcohol in the future, right? They don't, apparently they don't handle real meat very often, right? Like those are like those quirks that kind of make Star Trek that Star Trek-ness, right? Where like it's a future that is different. They have changed as they should change, but it's not like a bad change per se. But it's something that it's not just like the Expanse, Fatheree, right? Where it's just basically us with rail guns in the future, right? Or just us in space, we're still incredibly shitty to each other, and we're still there's no forward momentum, right? I think that's why Star Trek has aged so well, and Expanse, for as good as it is, Battlestar Galactica, for as good as it is, it doesn't have the same legs because it really just is us still, and we're super shitty. And I don't want to, I don't want to see that all the time, just to see us with more advanced weapons, but then still be shitty to each other, right? Star Trek, that's the whole point. That's the charm about it, is that they figured out a way to be better. And the best type of Star Trek is when they're a little corny about it, and they play it straight. And you know what? They don't shy away from we're corny about it, and we wear basically space pajamas, which is what that Dick Miller character was saying. Like, you guys are wearing pajamas. Who are you, right? Like, but you know what? That's the future that we've evolved into, right? So I think that's the secret sauce, if you will, that makes it work. Is the corniness of the Star Trek aspects to it.
Yeah, and I suppose that's the other thing that bothers me about The Expanse, is that it is so much modern society, but just 300 years in the future. And I often think like the way that we do things now is not sustainable. It's a ridiculous idea that we can keep doing this for 300 years and still exist. Like, that's not going to happen.
Between the two of you, are there any sort of more notably Marxist-minded sci-fi futures in like film or TV?
Not yet.
Interesting.
Not in mainstream. I think not in mainstream properties, and I think Star Trek only does it just because of its original premise. It kind of just begs the question, but it never deliberately kind of tries to answer it in a Marxist way, right. But just its setting heavily implies a lot of things, which is the charm of it. But I think there's not a lot to Father's point. I don't think there's a lot of it, because unfortunately, a lot of these mainstream properties reflect the thinking of the time. And thinking of the time for a very long time now has been one of cynicism and one of kind of a dystopia. Mm-hmm. And Marxism is an emancipatory framework, a perspective to say that we can resolve these things. But if everything is, we haven't solved it, we can't solve it, or the world ends and things are somehow even worse, right? And the only way forward is just ultimately just maybe some small ball answer of just like, we just got to be kind to ourselves and our friends and family. That's the best we could do, best we could hope for. Like it shows you that there is that comes from the prevailing mindset of that time, which is still the prevailing mindset right now, one of cynicism, right? So that's why you have shows like this, where unfortunately, like The Walking Dead and Breaking Bad and all this type of stuff, it's good drama, well acted, but I mean, after a while, you're kind of like, I don't want to watch just shitty people being shitty people, right? Like, so what's the way forward? What's the way out? And I don't think yet. There maybe Orville, which is because it's Star Trek pastiche. It's positive. That's probably the closest I would say. Maybe Galaxy Quest, but it's a larger satire, really. But again, all those things are plays off of the Star Trek, right? Galaxy Quest and Orville are all plays off of Star Trek. And in Star Trek, I think the fact that makes it kind of inadvertently Marxist is that it presents an environment, a setting where they say, we figured it out and the world doesn't destroy itself. It's a one world government, which is a pretty revolutionary outcome, right?
Increasingly discussed in, I think we probably talked about it in our previous episode, increasingly spoken of in those terms, in sort of Marxist terms, in fandom right now. One day those people in fandom may be the people writing the shows, so we'll see if what's what's unspoken never becomes spoken, but it is more spoken than it was before, at least.
Yeah, well, I know that there are some writers on Discovery that want to sneak some of that in there, so I wish them luck. But the one thing we haven't talked about at all in this episode, and I don't know if y'all would have anything to say, but the character Webb, the family man who they wanted to make him like the face of the Bell riots, and he ends up getting blasted by the SWAT raid at the end. But did you have anything to say about Webb?
He is the kind of a sort of principled character who he walks the line. He's not the hothead that that BC is. He's smart about things, forward thinking. He's maybe a little too ideal to have like a lot of like make me think like, oh, well, yeah, what a great character he is. But I thought he was well acted and that there was a sort of a nuance to the portrayal. So I think it's a great role. But I don't know that like, it particularly provoked any special reaction from me, other than an admiration for the actor and I think some good writing in there too.
Yeah, he is in a way, a stereotypical story. He's the one that you're supposed to relate to, right? So unlike BC, he's the relatable character in that time. In addition to, again, I'm blanking on the rich guy's name, but the rich guy, BC, and him, he's the other character that you're supposed to interact with and engage with as a character, as the audience. I mean, it is what it is. I think he does play up that model. He's not a minority, but basically kind of like that model type character, saying like, he's written in a very incredibly sympathetic way, right? So he has a family, he has a son, he wants to do the right thing. He's the one that kind of shocks Sisko into acting, because initially, Sisko was sure like, hey man, we're just minding our own business, man. Hey, just don't bother us, right? He's all like, you know what? The only way we're gonna get out of this is we work together, right? But hey, whatever, you do what you got to do, right? And kind of that's what kind of sticks with Sisko later on. Like, you know what, he's right. And he's the one that, of course, is the one that gets killed, of course. But I think in a lot of ways, it's a character you see a lot in these types of stories. It's well acted for what it is, but it does play up to a lot of the sympathetic tropes, where like the only way you can sympathize with these people is if you make them somehow very palatable to other people. He plays a role in the story, but ultimately, it would have liked to have seen him survive, but I guess someone had to die in many of these types of stories. So that's a little cliche, a little trite.
Yeah, but I kind of did like the violence and cruelty of the SWAT team coming in at the end, because it as something that's become even more relevant now that we're all walking around with digital cameras in our pockets and we can document it. The level of police brutality in our country, where the three of us are located in the United States, is just insane, and a lot of that's fueled by the prison industrial complex and trying to create more arrests, more contact with the police, incarcerate more people. It's sad that is something that still is relevant to today, but it's kind of a testament to Star Trek that this specific story is so relevant to things going on now in the year 2021. Star Trek does this all the time. We've had so many discussions here on Tex-Trek where we're like, oh yeah, this episode made decades ago really has a lot to say about something happening today. So that's they definitely have like their finger on the pulse a lot of times, and are telling stories that do have some impact in reality.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember just in discussing Discovery with who was the head of the Emerald Chain?
Osira,
yeah. The question of sort of reconciliation and essentially a quick exoneration of her could not help but come at an interesting time right as Trump's presidency was ending, and there were questions about legally pursuing him or absolving him, pardoning, any of those kind of questions. It felt timely, to say the least.
No, I never suspected that Trump would ever like spend a single moment in prison or in a even in a courtroom, probably, because this is not how it works. People in power, like they don't want you to like come after, like, no president, Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, Joe Biden, like no one wants them to be like, oh yeah, we need to set a precedent of like holding us accountable after we get out of office. Like I promise, like none of them, no one in power wants that at all. So
right. Well, and so that's why Trek is kind of maybe the fantasy of how it might work in a sort of more a time of deeper morality.
Sure. Yeah, and if we can't have justice in our reality, then we should at least be able to imagine it in our imagination, or else how do we ever hope to accomplish that in our future?
They and I know in the deal in 1984 was to expunge words from the dictionary, and kind of like remove the notions of sedition and rebellion. In its way, this is something that science fiction can do, is to the vocabulary of ideas, is to keep them alive, keep them fresh, make sure that they're still potent, even if we're not engaging in them currently. It becomes part of our way of thinking.
Well, I have, I guess, one last observation, and then I'll ask both of y'all if you have any final thoughts before we call it a day. But just one thing I wanted to point out, I actually heard this on the Mission Logs podcast when those guys, John Champion and Ken Tripp, watched this episode. Mission Logs is really cool. I highly recommend people check out that podcast. But Clint Howard's character, he shows up briefly. Great character actor Clint Howard has been in Star Trek multiple times, going all the way back to the original series. The Carbonite Maneuver. He was the little kid, Baylock, drinking the Tranya.
Iconic.
He's kind of a, I guess we could assume probably a mentally ill person living on the streets. And his whole thing was like, I'm invisible. And, he's like surprised that Jadzia can see him. One of the things that Ken Tripp pointed out was, like the idea of like hiding away the homelessness, making it where we don't have to see it, where we don't have to deal with it, we don't have to think about it. He was invisible to that society, and in his mental state, he kind of accepted it and interpreted it in kind of an entertaining way. If you just need like kind of a goofy character in one scene, but
you could argue you could argue that it's not the most nuanced portrayal of mental illness. It's a little bit of a mental illness as somewhat as novelty. It almost in that sense reminded me of how almost more like how TOS would have handled it. But because I also know Clint Howard's tradition with Trek, and the 90s, there was still these kind of maybe a little bit clumsier humor than we might like. So I still enjoyed the scene, even though I was thinking like, I don't know if that's how mental illness works.
That's true. I think Clint Howard, and I think going back to Baylock, going back to Discovery. He was in that scene in season one finale, right?
Oh, right. He was on was it Kronos?
He was on Kronos.
He was the Orion doing drugs.
He got Tilly high, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
Will You Take My Hand? I believe is the name of the episode.
Yep. And Star Trek always has a great tradition of doing these types of little guest spots, reusing actors. Brock Peters is another great example of reusing a character. Even I'm blanking on his name. The actor who plays Tom Paris,
Robert Duncan
McNeil, right? Reusing him, literally playing multiple characters, very similar characters. Michael Dorn, so many other characters. But I think that's the charm of Star Trek, is that it survives so long in so many iterations that you kind of almost plug and play a lot of these actors, and a lot of these character actors. That's sometimes their calling card to attend conventions and fandom events. It's like, hey, I was in this episode, I was in this thing, and it's really great to see them. They're almost kind of like the real, in a way, the real working class actors, right? When they're not on the main stage, but they're in the vendor's room, and then they have their own setup, and they say, hey, I was in this episode. Natalia Mikulic, who plays Admiral Cheev, is great at these conventions where she plays a really great quote unquote minor character, right? But you kind of see her in the vendor's room at Star Trek Las Vegas, what have you, setting up.
She shows up in uniform.
She shows up in uniform. She kind of mans her own booth, saying I was in this episode, and chats up, and more than always happy to kind of make the time for the fans. Whereas some of the bigger stars, right, they kind of have like a receiving line. It's kind of a bigger deal, right? And so I think Star Trek, because it's existed for like so long, there's so many episodes that you have a lot of these actors who, in some ways they're in this one episode of Star Trek, and yet somehow, and they've done a bunch of other things, but that one episode of Star Trek is what people always come back to. So I think that's the fun part about this fandom, is that it can draw in a bunch of people, even actors, to its larger mythos.
Even Dick Miller had multiple Star Trek appearances. He was in Next Generation in the Dixon Hill holodeck. He was the guy at the newspaper stand, right?
Was he? See, now I learn new stuff all the time. See, like stuff like that.
I at Memory Alpha, I had to click on him because I was like, "There's no way he's been in more than one episode, right?" And I saw that. I didn't see what episode it was, but I saw that he had been in a previous one. Dick Miller as a character actor is a person who I see, and I'm like, I assume he is exactly in person like every character he's playing. And I was like, what did he make of this episode? I did think about that while I was watching it. Was he like, what are these candy asses? What story are they trying to tell here? But I don't know what he's like at all in real life. You know, I just know that he was great. He's always great at the kind of working class persona, and usually a curmudgeon. He's like, that's key to him. But yeah, I don't see him showing up at a convention in uniform. But I would have been interested.
Passed away recently.
Yeah, I guess it would be startling if he were to show. But but there's a part of me that kind of wants to know what his thoughts on the episode were. You know, Father, there was one other thing I was going to mention. It was just something I noted while I was watching it. You know, there's a sort of there's that phrase, the banality of evil, and there's as I was watching this episode, and I was thinking about it a little bit in the way they showed the lives that these folks were living. You know, a life of like identification cards, long employment lines, and you know, and just sitting in dingy rooms, like getting rousted by the cops, having, you know, sort of your entire self-worth evaluated as to, you know, how employable you are. That there was, I thought there was a lot of subtle stuff like that going on in the episode that I really appreciated. That, you know, it's one of those things completely timeless, and that I thought that they nailed just all the small stuff like that.
Cool. Will, any final thoughts from you?
Actually, I think Dave, I'll use Dave's point to jump off. That's actually a great observation. Like that entire scene, right, when they're first just waiting, almost in that DMV-like waiting room, right, to be processed, right? They're just like,
you can see Sisko is used to moving things forward and is struggling with it.
Right. So they're just, yeah, and but we as the audience, like, oh, we know that's a DMV. That's every, bureaucracy that we have to manage, the machinery that just grinds people down under the minutia of, like you said, banality of this evil, mundane thing. It's evil, but it's not as evil, quote unquote, because it's so mundane. It just happens,
right?
And everyone plays their small piece of it, but that piece still contributes to the machine running you over just slowly under the sheer weight of it. And I think that's exactly right. I think just everything about it, here, you fill this thing out, right? They just tell them, sit down, fill this thing out, and they're basically telling them, don't move. We have the guns, just and they're being processed through, right? I mean, and what's that most common analogy right now? It's what's happening at the border right now, right? What happened, to, with kids in cages now to become, overflow facilities, right, for children, for underage minors, right, unaccompanied minors, right? It becomes lost in this bureaucratic jargon, because that's the only way you could disguise this evil, is if you disguise it in this jargon that's incomprehensible, this gobbledygook, right? Overflow facilities for unaccompanied minors. I mean, concentration camps, internment camps, get to the point, right? And that's what it is. You can see pictures that are leaked, right, of them just sitting in these prefabbed areas, right? With the almost like the aluminum foil prefab type of stuff. There's a particularly chilling scene or image of them like watching like Dora the Explorer, and there's stuff to for childcare behind literally like a chain link fence, right? Like that is the banality of all this type of stuff, right? Mm-hmm. And the hopelessness that you see in this episode is a hopeless that you see in people that don't see a way out until bang, there is an event that happens, right? When it just becomes too much. Last year was George Floyd being murdered. That was the bang, right? We have many other bangs, right, down the road, right, as the class struggle intensifies, right? And the point of it is there a way forward? Is this the best that we can do? Star Trek says, hey, we can figure it out. As a Marxist, we can absolutely figure it out. There's a history of figuring it out. there is something we can do. But I think that's what gets people, is that if they don't see a way forward, they're just going, hey man, I'm just trying to get by. I tried to change things once and didn't do anything, so I'm just going to keep my head down and not do anything. And here's the thing, that only lasts for so long because everyone has a breaking point, and people will move into action. So yeah, you're right. That's what makes this episode, I think, really, really good. It's that mood that they set. Yeah, I think I'll end it there. I think that's why this episode just deserves rewatch all the time, is because of all those little things.
Yeah,
Right
certainly. So it's a great example of Star Trek telling us that we can do better, and therefore asking the question, well, how do we get there? And it doesn't have the answer, but we have to ask the question before we can answer it. And Will has the answer. Go read his StarTrek.com interview, and check out his previous appearance on Tex-Trek. I'll have a link to that in the description. But thank you, Will, for joining us. We love having you aboard.
Yeah,
always a pleasure talking Trek with you two fine gentlemen. Always love to do it whenever you guys are doing it.
And I'll just let everyone know that next week we'll be back to finish our discussions of Star Trek Deep Space Nine Season 3. We're going to be talking about the second half of Season 3, so episode 14, Heart of Stone, all the way to episode 26, The Adversary. We'll be covering that next week.
That Season 3 finale, huh?
Yeah. I'm
Season 2 had a cliffhanger as well.
Yeah.
Cliffhanger-ish anyway.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to Dave's reaction to it when we get there. But until then, as always, live long and prosper, y'all.
Listen to the Tex-Trek podcast through Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or at tex-trek.com. Like us on Facebook at facebook.com/tex-trek, and follow Fatheree on Twitter at TXTrek. Please support us by liking our videos and subscribing to our channel on YouTube. Thank you and take care.